What an honor it is to be with you this morning. It's been a while, but it's good to be back, and it's a lovely day to be out on the road. I live in Bloomington, if you're not aware of that, and I travel around Illinois and Wisconsin, and these days I'm now the regional minister for Michigan. I don't go there very often, but next month, and the month after, and the month after, I'm up there. So I covet your prayers as we travel around, and then again, grateful to your pastor, Dwight, for the invitation to be here, and it's just a good day. It's a good day. I want to read for you from Matthew's Gospel, verses 17, verses 1 to 9. This in the church year is called Transfiguration Sunday. This is the story that is read in the cycle of the church year that talks about a mountaintop experience that Jesus had with his disciples. And it's a turning point as you read through the scriptures. It's one of those pivot points in the life and ministry of Jesus. So this from Matthew 17, verses 1 to 9. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. And suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. And then Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it's really good that we're here. And if you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And while he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, This is my son, the beloved, with him I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell on the ground and were overcome with fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, Get up and do not be afraid. And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. Will you pray? O God, you alone are our salvation. Help us to be open to your word. Soften our hearts and our minds and our spirits to listen for your wisdom. For it is your way that brings blessing. Amen. I gotta love a church where the liturgist decides to play. I don't even know the name of that group. I know that song is from Shrek. I know it from Shrek.
Yeah. Chupa-Woobas, I think.
Yeah. I don't care. I love it. It is just so good to be with you. And I think of you, this beautiful little church. I think of you as the little church that could, you know? You just keep chugging up the mountain, offering hope and nurturing leaders, you know, Colton Lott and Isaac Ackerman, and sharing blessings. And you know what? When I say that, when I wrote that, I said, that sounds a lot like Dwight Wynn. Well, you have been together a long time, right? And we do begin to reflect one another in good ways. Hopefully in a light shining forth kind of way into this world. Sort of like what happens with Jesus when he's transfigured by God in the presence of Moses and Elijah on the top of that mountain. A light shining forth that's more than change. The word is transfigured. We'll come back to that. Recently, I've been listening to podcasts. Now, this is a really funny thing because this person right here doesn't have a playlist. I had a pastor recently say, what's on your playlist? I don't have a playlist. And I hardly ever listen to podcasts, but you know, I have a new iPhone and there's this app and I found a podcast and I listened to it. So I just need you to know this is a strange thing that's happening today. But I was recently listening to this podcast by social scientist Brene Brown. Maybe some of you have heard of Brene Brown. She is this wonderful person who talks about vulnerability and being brave, making brave space. I encourage you to take a look at her or listen to her or look up her books. They're wonderful. They're in the public library, by the way. And then she was talking to this person who was a neuroscientist named Dr. David Engelman. And the title of this particular podcast was The Inside Story of the Ever-Changing Brain. That had me thinking about the transfiguration in some very new way. Again, a reminder, if I can listen to podcasts, anybody can change. Anyway, what I learned was that our brains are resilient. They are amazing, ever-changing, and they are able to create new pathways and connections. That's what our brains are all about, making pathways and connections. And as Dr. Eagleman said, our brains are live wired, so that the wiring is happening even now, live wired. For example, even now, our brains are changing right now. As we're gathered together in this room, our brains are responding to what's being sung and what's being said and what's being prayed and what's being heard. Even this sermon. Our brains are actively working to make sense of what is going on. It's not a conscious thing. It's not like the brain up here and you yourself are thinking out loud what's going on. It's happening without our consent. Actually, sorry, I'm going to fall over. It's happening. Our brains, even now, in this moment. As a matter of fact, even if we weren't listening to a sermon, even if we were just gathered around the table and we were praying with one another silently in community, our brains would be stimulated into action. The greatest challenge for our brains, they said, I think this just goes without saying, but it's really fun to say it. The greatest challenge for our brains is other people. Surprise? The greatest challenge for our brains is other people, which is why some of us avoid other people. And it's also why, if we want our brains to stay healthy, we need to stay connected to other people, challenging people. I know, it goes against the grain, doesn't it? The common thought is, I want to go off into my quiet retirement by myself. But for the health and well-being of our brains, we need to keep learning. And we need to stay engaged in communities. And we need to go to church. So here's your tagline for church. And I know it's not always easy being in church, but it's good for your brain. And those of us who are growing older, my mother had Alzheimer's type dementia. And we learned that the pathways of her brain were shutting down. The messages that were supposed to pass from one synapse to another, or one neuron to another, they were not working. It was not happening. Those messages sent from neuron to neuron were not being sent, and the medications that they developed were to try to stimulate the message carrying, because her brain was deteriorating. It was so fascinating to me to listen to Dr. Eagleman in this podcast talk about a convent full of nuns who were growing older together. And their convent wasn't taking in any new members or any new converts. So they were aware that they were going to be the last ones in this order who were going to be living together in this convent. And you know what they decided to do? They decided they would all donate their brains to science when they died. How about that? So even as they aged toward their ending, they would give this gift to science. And so they lived out their lives together in close contact with each other. They worked together. They read together. They studied together. They gardened together. They cooked together. They worshiped together. They cleaned up together. They did life together. And what they found from the gift that these women gave to science was that these women's brains, from this group of nuns, some of them actually had dementia, but the symptoms didn't show up. The symptoms did not arise. This group of women in lively connection to one another were fostering new pathways, folks. They were fostering and stimulating new pathways within the diseased brains of their sisters. Wow. I want to go back to church may not always be easy, but it's good for your brain. You don't know that that's not everything, but certainly it matters. We are changed. We are changed at our most basic level of our being by our connection to one another. By our connection to one another. So, there's Jesus taking his disciples up this mountain, and he's transfigured the word. And it's more than an advertisement for some new tide, okay? It's more than glowing white clothes that have been bleached and are lit up by the afternoon light. It's more than a temporary glow, because you do get a glow when you climb the mountain that he climbed. It's more than a temporary glow, and it's more than just being in the presence of God, which there are times when we pray and we know we're in the presence of God, and you know there's a difference in who you are. It's more than that even. More than a spotlight from a cloud in a theatrical production that leaves the disciples speechless, wanting never to leave this place. Let's not go back. Let's not go back to those crowds, Jesus. Let's stay here. Let's stay here with you in this moment and in this light. And the voice of God in the story makes it clear to everyone, Jesus is formed. Oh, Jesus is formed by this connection. This connection. This is my beloved Son. Jesus is formed by this connection to an eternal community. Isn't it amazing? Moses and Elijah, this eternal community. Jesus is connected to this eternal community. Moses and Elijah and God's own presence are there. He's called them to bring this connection, this divine human connection into the world so that others can see it, even into this world that is so different from the one on top of that mountain. Even as we seem so disconnected from one another and from the source of life alone, Jesus is called to bring that connection to us in this world. Jesus said, get up. He touches them. Isn't it really important? Don't you think? Touches them. And he says, get up and do not be afraid. It's time to take this connection into the world. No matter what happens, I need you to hear me, he says. No matter what happens, even my death, this connection is unbroken. This connection is unbroken. We are shaped by our connections, whether we like it or not. We are shaped by our relationships and our connections. We are indeed transfigured by the community that we keep. You and Pastor Dwight, it's kind of like having a dog that looks like you, right? He probably won't appreciate that. A convent full of nuns are shaped. Jesus and the great cloud of witnesses, Moses and Elijah, and God's own self. Jesus is shaped by those connections. Jesus' transfiguration gave him clarity of purpose to say, get up and do not be afraid, no matter what happens next. It matters the company we keep. There's a lot in our common life today telling us to be afraid. Am I right? There is a lot in our common life today telling us to be afraid. There's a lot in our common life today that's saying disconnect, get away from those people. Yeah. Isolate. Let's build our own little dwelling place. It's not only bad for our brains, but it's bad for Christ's mission in this world. It's a disconnection from all that gives us life. Get out. Don't be afraid. Amen. I believe we sing a hymn, number 611, Rise Up, O Saints of God. It is a hymn of invitation. Let us just remember that we are and exist in this community because of the call of Jesus on our lives. Let's stand and sing. are loved. You are enough for this moment, and you are not alone. So get up and be nice.